Okay, 511 here, we're going to look at explaining the equivalent fractions rule. You know, hopefully, kind of how to figure out those equivalent fractions, but we're just going to do a little bit more explaining of it. So we'll do this first part here together. So write 3 equivalent fractions for each. Remember, in any equivalent fraction, you're basically timesing the numerator and denominator by the same number. So you do any number that you want. So this, like, times it by 2 ways would work. By 3 12ths. By 10 40ths would work. There's a lot of different ways you can do those sorts of things. By 20, this one would be 40 over 60. So again, you're timesing the numerator and the denominator by the exact same number. You're just multiplying. If you think of 2/3, draw a little. So 2/3 is right here, there, and there. When you multiply it by a number, what you're getting now is 60 pieces all together in this little box. So instead of these 3, we've got 60 of them. And then you're coloring in the ones that would have these double marks sort of thing that would all be marked would be 40 of them. That's an equivalent fraction. You're just making your pieces, usually they're smaller, sometimes maybe even bigger. So complete page 184. Be prepared to explain your thinking. So here are your problems. 5 times 1/2 is it greater than, less than, or equal to 5. You're doing that for each of these things right here. Hopefully you start to recognize maybe a pattern that's going to happen here. What do you notice about the number sentences? And how do you know whether each product was greater than, less, or less than 5? And hopefully what I just explained to you a little bit before is going to make you get that done. So I want you to do this. Pause the video right now, write down greater than, less than for each of these things, and then you can start the video back up. I'll put some answers on them. I'll do some explaining with this. If you have a partner that you're with, maybe at the same section, you guys can talk about these 2 questions together before you start the lesson, but if you don't, it's not a big deal. So go ahead, pause it, do these 3 or these 5 problems, and then we'll go from there. So in this, what you're hopefully seeing and knowing, whenever you multiply by a fraction, you know instantly that it's going to be less than. That it's going to be less than. Because this answer, whatever you multiply by, is going to be less than 5, because it's not a whole number. These guys would be equal. This has a whole number in it. So you'll see instantly, then you should guess, you should know that that's bigger. And then this one too would end up being a whole number because it's an improper fraction. So you know it's going to be a little bit greater than 5 as well. So, do you have any questions on how this works? But how do you, well, what did you notice? Well, I noticed when I multiplied by a fraction that my answer was going to be less than 5. And if I multiplied by a whole number, it was going to be greater than 5. That's what you're really looking for here. So, what is the product when you multiply 5 by 1? It's 5. 12 times 1 is 12. 2/3 times 1 is 2/3. 6,789 by 1 is the same. What could you summarize? How could you summarize the results of multiplying by 1? You get the exact same number that you had before. That's what you would get. But when you multiply by a fraction, you know, something along those lines, that number is going to end up being less than. So if you had this as a fraction instead of 1, the number is going to be less than what you have over here. That's what you get for your answer. We talked about that a little bit at the beginning of this video, but we've got to keep that in mind. Whenever you do that, it's going to be less than. So here's part of your assignment is to do a little bit of this work. Pretty straightforward. Again, what are some equivalent fractions for 1? How do you make 1? What are some equivalent fractions for 4/5? Explain how you know that the fractions you found in part B are equivalent to 4/5. Remember what I said at the beginning of the video again about multiplying by a fraction. What are you essentially doing to that number? Here's some work for you to do, so we can go through this. Again, looking at this, this would end up being 8/12, which is the same thing as 2/3. Why is it the same? Because 4 over 4 is 1. 15/20ths. It's the same thing as 3/4 because you're multiplying by 1. 10/12, again, same idea. 9 24ths. Same kind of thing that's going on here. All of these fractions are equivalent to 1. So you get these are equivalent fractions. This one, all of these are equivalent to that over there because you're multiplying by the same numbers. But when you go to do the rest of this page, you're just kind of looking at that. Fraction name for one equivalent fraction. So that's why you get that rule for equivalent fractions. When you multiply the numerator and denominator by the same number, just like we did in all of these, you get an equivalent fraction because it's the same number, because 4/4 is the same thing as multiplying it by 1. That's the rule that you're kind of following. You can't do anything different, multiply by two different numbers, because then it's not multiplying it by 1. Any number multiplied by 1 is itself. That's how you get your equivalent fractions. So that's, again, in a nutshell, what you're going to be looking at, what you're going to be doing today is just understanding that rule and why it occurs that 8/12 is the same as 2/3, because you're multiplying it by 4/4, which is the same as 1. And the rule is, whenever you multiply by 1, you get the same number. Even though it looks different, they look different, these two do, but they're the exact same thing. So if you have any questions, be sure that you ask loud. I think it's pretty straightforward.